Howdy, everybody. Today we're talking about George Washington in the American Revolution. So, before we kind of talk about Washington during the Revolution itself, we're going to talk about George Washington kind of in the years preceding it. So, the decade or two prior to that, particularly around the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War. Now, if you remember from the French and Indian War video, it's the French and the Indians versus the British and their colonists. It's not the French fighting the Indians, although there was a little bit of that. It's mainly the French and their Indian allies fighting the British and their colonial allies. Now, George Washington was a colonist. This made him kind of a second-class citizen in the British Empire. But he thought if he could prove himself during the French and Indian War, then he could maybe earn his way into the British Royal Army and maybe earn a rank and a title and all those kinds of things. So that was his goal. Demonstrate his success and prowess in battle, and maybe that would earn him a place in the British Army. So when we're talking about the French and Indian War or the 7 Years' War, you got to understand this is a truly world war at the time. This is kind of one of the first world wars during this period. So everything in green is fighting everything in blue. And everything in the little red areas is where the fighting is actually happening. So the two main areas of fighting is right along the American colonies in Canada and then in Europe. You have fighting all around the world though. So basically anywhere there were French and British colonies next to each other, there was fighting. So this is a pretty massive war. What starts the war, at least in the colonies, is the British colonies, is George Washington is sent out to deal with a fort called Fort Duquesne. So it looks like Fort Duquesne, but it's pronounced Fort Duquesne. He's sent to go push them out because the British see it as an encroachment on their territory that the French established as fort. They go out, there's a skirmish, and Washington is forced to retreat. And in his retreat, he realizes he's not going to be able to outrun the French. So he and his colonial troops set up a fort called Fort Necessity. And as you can see, Fort Necessity is not exactly the most robust defensive position. And unfortunately for Washington's troops, it was mainly Washington, the officers, and the injured that were inside the makeshift fort. Everyone else was outside. So it didn't even do what a fort was really supposed to do. So not an ideal situation, but nonetheless. And given its name, Fort Necessity, Washington established and built this fort hastily out of necessity. And ultimately, Washington will be defeated, he'll be captured, and then ransomed back later during the war. So this is the Washington that's going to lead us to success in the Revolution. Not doing so hot. In the War of 1812, or not the War of 1812, in the French and Indian War, he has lost a major battle. It has sparked a bigger conflict that leads into greater fighting between the British and the French. So Washington, not off to a great start. Now, a few years go by, a decade or so, decade and a half, you have lead up through the Revolution. Finally, it's time for the Revolution itself. You have the Continental Congress deciding we need to have an army, and they turn to the best, most experienced general we have in America, which is George Washington, who lost a major battle. So Washington is not coming as a true hero. He's going to become one during the war. But right now, he's starting from pretty much scratch. And what's worse is he has to build our army from scratch. We have what's called a militia in the United States. So militia is basically a group of civilians that got together once, twice a month, practiced, drilling different marches, shooting a little bit, but mainly it came down to a gentleman's club, a club for men to go hang out, shoot guns, and then have a big barbecue with their families afterwards. It didn't focus as much on the military as it did on the social aspect. So what Washington's inheriting, this militia system, is not a very robust military organization. It's going to take Washington several years and lots of setbacks before he's able to turn this militia-focused army into a truly professional army, the United States Army, or what it's called at this point in time is the Continental Army. So, one of the first major battles is the Siege of Boston, following shortly after the Battle of Bunker Hill. So if you kind of look right up over here on the right, you see kind of Bunker Hill. And on the left, you'll see kind of the parallel image, kind of more detailed and drawn out. But you can see after the Battle of Bunker Hill, you can read more about the battle itself, and it really just showed that the colonists were able to fight the British. But what it does lead to is what's called the Siege of Boston. Like the minor defeat at Bunker Hill for the colonists led Washington. You kind of see all these little blue shapes. So all along here, kind of down and around and up onto these hills overlooking the city of Boston. They have cannons pointed at the city. So they are pointing at the city, and it is putting the city under threat. And if they can capture the city, if they can siege it, basically trap it, and trap the army, the British army within it, they can capture that army and make or achieve a major victory. The problem is, the British have a decided advantage, and that's going to be their navy. So whenever a British army gets trapped in a city or along the coast, the British Navy just arrives, loads it up, and moves it somewhere else, and they begin fighting over there. So this is going to be one of Washington's big weak points. He doesn't have a navy, and the British are able to move and resupply their army with their navy anytime they want, and Washington can't stop them. So he's hoping to capture an army in Boston. He does capture the city of Boston, liberate it, but the British army leaves. And they're going to the most important port in the Americas, which is New York. So Washington doesn't have a navy, so he and his army, while the British are sailing up the coast to New York, Washington and the Continental Army have to run all the way to New York. So they're marching double time. And they barely make it to Staten Island and Long Island before the British arrive. And they barely get there just in time to set up a few ramshackle defenses, but the British are far more prepared and are able to push and destroy many of the continental defenses. In particular, they capture almost in the Battle of Long Island almost immediately about 1,000 American troops. And you can kind of see in this long chase going all over upstate New York and then into New Jersey, Washington is fighting, but he doesn't want to come to a major battle because the British are more skilled, more equipped. They are just better at war than Washington and his army. So Washington is going to focus on something called an army in being. As long as Washington can keep his army together, the war will continue. But for Washington, that means never coming to a major battle. Like he only is going to pick a big fight if he can win it. Otherwise, he's going to run up, sucker punch him, give him a black eye, and then run the hell away as fast as he can. Because he could hit them, he could injure them, but if he tries to duke it out face to face, one-on-one, it's not going to go well. He will lose, and he knows that. So he thinks in his mind, he's rightfully thinking this, if he can keep his army together and keep it fighting, then the war is not over. But the problem is, after the Battle of Long Island, the New York Campaign, Washington is trapped out in New Jersey in the middle of winter. Now, armies don't typically fight during winter. They go into what's called winter quarters. Problem is, Washington doesn't have anywhere to go into winter quarters, so he's in the middle of nowhere. He is freezing. His troops are running out of food, so he gets desperate. And this is when, kind of a few days before Christmas, he gets an idea. He hears about some troops, some British mercenaries called Hessians from Germany, have a big camp, have a lot of supplies, and they're about the right size that Washington thinks if he can take them by surprise, they can do well in this battle. So, in the middle of the night, they cross the Delaware River. You can kind of see this river's frozen. This is a treacherous crossing. Now, Washington probably wouldn't have been standing like the portrait shows, or the painting shows, but nonetheless, they dramatized it. But he does cross in the middle of the night, this daring crossing of the river, and they arrive at the Battle of Trenton. Now, this is a significant battle. They kill, anywhere from 1 to 200 Hessian troops, Hessian and British troops. They capture another 800, and about 600 or 700 get away in the night. Now, the way Washington planned it was when they attacked Trenton, they did it they kind of crossed the river Christmas Eve, and then Christmas morning, they arrive and attack Trenton. Now, knowing that these Hessians were German, And Germans like drinking. They're going to celebrate Christmas Eve and Christmas with singing and drinking, so by Christmas morning, they're all hungover. So when the colonial troops attacked, when the US troops attacked, everyone's basically asleep in their tent. So we take only a handful of casualties, maybe 3 to 5 casualties on the American side, where we deal a devastating blow to the British, and we get all the resources we need to keep fighting the war. So this is a big step forward. Now Washington thinks, okay, we did really well at Trenton, let's keep the momentum going. So he's going to fight 2 more successive battles. So you have the Battle of Trenton, you kind of see him kind of sneaking in and trying to surround. And they do very well. But you have the Battle of Princeton, and then shortly thereafter, the Battle of Germantown. Now, both of these are Washington trying to capitalize on the momentum that he's built so far in the war after the Battle of Trenton. Both these battles are either a stalemate or a mild loss for the colonists. Both times, Washington manages to escape with his army, and he's not defeated properly, but it's not a victory that he was looking for. So things are not going great for Washington. And Washington realizes he's going to need help. He needs aid. His army alone is not big enough. So this is where Washington and the Continental Congress think, well, the enemy of my enemy must be my friend. So the greatest enemy of the British is the French. So we got to find a way to persuade the French to come in and aid the United States, this fledgling country. And this is where we get the Saratoga Campaign. So Washington is off, over here fighting. He's trying to distract the main general of the British called General Howe. While he's off distracting out kind of western Pennsylvania and further south, you have Gates and General Arnold fighting up against a guy named Burgoyne. So you see Burgoyne up here. Now Burgoyne is marching down from British Canada, trying to smash Gates and Arnold's army between Howe's army coming up and Burgoyne's coming south. But the problem is, General Howe left and didn't tell Burgoyne he was leaving, and this creates a situation where Gates and Arnold are able to defeat Burgoyne. This is a massive defeat. This is the Battle of Saratoga. So this is a huge step forward. About 3,000 to 4,000 British troops surrender to the United States, and this is a huge victory, a big enough victory that Washington is able to write to a representative in France, and they're able to persuade the French to join. It's clearly not a lost cause anymore. If we're able to defeat a major British army, maybe we can win this whole war with a little bit of French aid. But even once we get the promise of French aid, Washington still has to survive the rest of the war. And this is where we get to a major turning point in the war for Washington and his army. This is the winter at Valley Forge. So Washington, coming into winter at a location called Valley Forge, was in dire straits. His army was worn out. You can kind of see from the picture, it's a little blurry, but you can see from the picture the soldiers are without shoes. Many of them are in tattered clothes. They don't have supplies or food. Washington spends most of the winter writing letters, traveling to request food and aid, all this kind of stuff. The government, which is the Articles of Confederation, which haven't quite been finished yet, they're just starting to come about at this point in time. We're still operating under, the committees of correspondence and the Continental Congress and all this kind of stuff. They aren't really supplying much money. So Washington's trying to get everything together. And he goes out every day, talks to the troops, tries to boost morale. And this is when the army really starts looking at Washington, not just as their general, but as kind of a father figure. And more importantly, a German officer that had been kicked out of the German army for various reasons arrived in the colonies and offered his aid to the Americans, to Washington. So this German general is Frederick von Steuben, and he's going to drill the American troops. He's going to beat them into a new professional army. And come spring, when winter begins to thaw and spring comes, the army that survived Valley Forge is better equipped thanks to Washington's effort, better trained thanks to von Steuben, And this army is able to go toe-to-toe with the British. They're still waiting to have enough troops, particularly with the aid from the French, but they are starting to get kind of this first wave of French support coming in. The main French fleet with the army hasn't quite arrived yet. They're coming soon. Now, you have the Battle of Monmouth. And this is another one of those halfway defeats for Washington. So it's a little bit further south. They've kind of given up fighting in the north in the New York area, New York, New Jersey area. Now they're starting to move south. You have kind of a major turning point in the north coming with the West Point espionage. Now we talked about briefly General Benedict Arnold, who was one of the main generals at Saratoga, the biggest victory of the war pretty much at this point. Well, Arnold thought he had been looked over by Washington. So he petitions Washington for command of West Point. So today it's the West Point Military Academy, but at this point in history, it was a major fort, and they had a chain draped across the Hudson River to stop traffic going up or down that wasn't approved, to basically restrict British movement. Well, he petitioned Washington for command of the fort because he was going to turn the fort over to the British in exchange for an officer position in the British Army. He was going to betray the United States. And he does betray the US. And the way he does it, he's not able to get the fort into their hands, but he does switch sides. Now, Washington is right up here on the north side of the river. Arnold is down here, and in order to distract Washington and allow Arnold to escape, Arnold sends his wife over to Washington's camp to cook breakfast and distract him. And this buys him several hours for Arnold to escape with several documents and information to give to the British in exchange for his position in the British Army. And this is where you get kind of the story of Benedict Arnold, and kind of whenever someone's called Benedict Arnold in US, in the United States, it means they're a traitor. And he is kind of the most notorious traitor of American history. And what's sad is the United States ends up winning the war, and Benedict Arnold can't stay in the United States because he's a traitor, but he goes back to England because he sided with them, but no one in England really trusted him because he betrayed the United States. So they figured, oh, if he betrayed them, he might betray us as well. So basically, he lives this sad, exiled life, and no one really pays attention to him, even though that's why he betrayed the United States to begin with, was to get more attention and a higher rank. So it kind of backfired on Arnold all the way around. Now, while other armies, other continental armies for the United States are fighting in the South, there are several talked about in your book, George Washington is fighting several battles against the Six Nations, so the Iroquois Confederation. These are native allies of the British. So the colonists have been encroaching on Native American lands, so they side with the British, thinking if the British win, they can maybe stop colonial encroachments. So you have fighting amongst the Indians. You have the Southern campaigns I just alluded to. So you have all these Southern campaigns like the Battle of Cowpens and different things like that along the Southern ones. Washington doesn't get involved in those too much. He has other generals like Gates and different ones that are down there fighting. Now the big culminating battle of the whole war is the Battle of Yorktown. So this is where the British forces, under a British general named Cornwallis, are trapped in Yorktown along the York River just off the coast. Washington has his army kind of in this bottom right side surrounding it. Then the French army has arrived and has positioned themselves around the other side. And then they have up here on the other peninsula. So Cornwallis is trapped. Now remember, every time the British got trapped along the coast, they just brought their navy in, loaded up, and shipped out somewhere else. This time, the French have arrived, and in one of the few times the French Navy is able to defeat the British, it happens here. Usually the British always win naval battles, but at this particular battle, the Battle of Yorktown, the French Navy fights off the British, traps Cornwallis's army there, and Cornwallis is forced to surrender. Now Cornwallis is so ashamed of his defeat, he actually sends one of his subordinate officers to go surrender to George Washington, gives the officer a sword, and tells the officer to go surrender his sword to Washington. So this is kind of a thumbing of the nose to Washington, kind of disrespect, but also shows the shame of being defeated by the colonists. Now there's a few minor skirmishes after Yorktown, but this is pretty much the end of the main fighting. Cornwallis's army is the biggest army in the Americas, or in the colonies, so they are basically done. It'll take a few more, about a year and a half before a treaty's finally signed. The Treaty of Paris, 1776, but eventually it will be signed. Now, Washington has two more important kind of memories after the war, or points right after the end of the war. First is something called the Newburgh Conspiracy. Now, during the war, the US soldiers were not paid very often or very much. So by the end of the war, they had a lot of back pay they felt they deserved, and they really did deserve it. So many of the officers in the army got together and began talking. Maybe, as commanders of the army, we take this army to the government, overthrow the government, put our own leader in charge, and make them pay us. Basically, they were going to have a military coup. They just won the revolution, and the officers are already talking about having a military coup. Now, George Washington hears about this. And he says, hey, can I come talk to y'all? Like this meeting of officers that are contemplating this coup. And they think, oh, this is great. Washington is going to want to be our leader. We'll make him president for life. It'll be awesome. So Washington goes out and he's getting ready to give a speech. And he pulls out his little sheet of paper with his notes on it. And he kind of looks at it, kind of holds it off, and can't quite get a good look at it. And he says, kind of, one moment, forgive me. And he pulls out some glasses and puts them on. He says, forgive me, I've gone blind in service to my country. And at this word, this phrase, I've gone blind in service to my country, all those late nights writing letters by candlelight had damaged his eyesight so much that he had to start wearing glasses. But it kind of hit the core of every one of these officers that are contemplating a coup, betrayal of the United States. When Washington, their leader, their father figure, was saying, I have given up my own body for this revolution. And they're thinking of betraying those very ideals. Now in his speech, he basically says, you know, we fought so hard, let's not screw it all up right away. He's like, I will do my best to get the government to pay y'all, to do what y'all need. But you just got to be patient. You just got to give me time. Now, a second major issue. Now keep in mind, Washington's unique at this point. Many people who at this point in time would have been offered to be king of a brand new nation would have been like, hell yeah, that sounds like a great idea. Washington was like, no, I want to be a farmer. I want to go back to my plantation, run my plantation, brew beer. That's what I want to do. I don't want to be a politician. I don't want to be, president, certainly not president for life. I don't want to run a country. So he talks them out of it and all that kind of stuff. Now, there is a second thing that kind of goes back to his idea of wanting to be a farmer. He and many of the other officers of the army found the Society of the Cincinnati. Now, this guy that they are looking up to, Cincinnatus, he is a Roman leader. Basically, he became what's called like imperator, which was like a temporary general or first man of Rome in times of need. And he ran a big plantation, a big farm, much like Washington. He set it all down, went and did his service as a leader of Rome, fought for Rome, and then returned to being a farmer. So the Society of the Cincinnati is really this codification of the ideal of the citizen soldier, kind of the Cincinnatus-like figure, where in times of need, the farmer picks up, turns his plows into swords and goes to war, but when the war is over, they melt down their swords back into plows, and they go back to their everyday life. That's kind of how our army, in theory, works today. We do have a core professional army, but in times of war, we'll see this in World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, you get this call for average people to go to war. And this is kind of where this idea begins really getting codified in the American mind. So, stop there for today. We've talked about Washington for a while, kind of given a brief overview of Washington's role during the American Revolution. So we'll stop there and we'll pick up with the next video later.